Hello, I'm Diane Litman from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm going to share with you 3 challenges that are relevant to the field of learning engineering, namely privacy, ethics, and bias. Many of us are already familiar with issues of privacy from our other dealings with interactions on the web. The goals of privacy are that we need to recognize that people's privacy is something to be protected, that people should be able to control access to their information. And when people do agree to give up some of their privacy, that they understand the agreements that they've made with researchers, for example, in learning engineering, about how confidentiality will be maintained, particularly when in education, often very sensitive, personally identifiable information is involved. In the field of education, in fact, this issue has been recognized federally in the United States, and there's a law called FERPA that applies to schools that receive certain types of Department of Education funding and governs what kind of information can be released with respect to education records. To handle issues of privacy, good practices suggest development of data management plans, and in fact, federal agencies in the United States typically require researchers to specify what their data management plan is as part of seeking and obtaining funding. And these plans specify how one will responsibly collect, store, analyze, and sharing of data. So basically from the beginning throughout the process. And there are many standard guidelines that you can find information about, for example, ranging from when you collect the data to store the sensitive information separately from some version of the information where people's names have been replaced, for example, with IDs, for making sure that even if you do that, other aspects are not so specific that you could infer after the fact, and other type of techniques such as that. Related to privacy is the issues of ethics. And by this, I mean that it's, again, to obtain federal funding when you're dealing with data from humans, one usually has to specify that you are aware that you need to get informed consent from students and or teachers in an educational context, or that you've demonstrated that you can waiver this need. And in education, this is often particularly complicated because students, for example, are in many cases are minors in K through 12 settings. So there are different processes depending on whether you need to get consent from students who are adults, students who are children. If you can't get them from the children, how to involve the parents, and when you may be able to get a waiver for obtaining consent at all. Assuming you do need consent, there again are many well-established guidelines for the type of information that needs to be presented to the person who will give you their consent. Not surprisingly, the information needs to be written and presented at a level that's comprehensible for the target audience, and people need to be given an opportunity to discuss the information that they're given. Typically, however, key information includes things such as specifying the goal of the research, the procedures people will be involved in. Very importantly, identifying not only potential benefits, but also potential risks, such as breach of confidentiality. And again, specifying if you've developed a data management plan and exactly what protections you will take to maintain confidentiality. Finally, the last area I'd just like to briefly touch upon is bias. This is a relatively new area compared to the first 2 that I've talked about, but it's receiving increasing attention and research in the learning engineering community. And bias can occur in different type of ways. For example, one way might be that an algorithm has different error rates for different types of students. So for example, in an area that I work in, automated essay scoring, an algorithm might be biased if it typically underscores a particular demographic group, such as women. Related to the study of this area are to determine what type of groups that you need to examine. Some commonly demographic type characteristics are used to group students for investigating issues of fairness and bias, such as student gender, student race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status. But increasingly, it has become apparent that a wider range of categories need to be considered, for example, disability, native language, and many others. Not surprisingly, to do these type of studies, we need access to this information. And so there are often tensions with the type of information one can get based on privacy agreements. Another type of bias is that even if an algorithm is equally accurate for all groups, it might amplify inequities that are in a data set. So for example, we know that society has problems, that there might be things that don't need to be the case, but that actually are the case. And many current algorithms, if those things happen in the data, they'll learn them and perpetuate them. As I said, this is a very active area of research. So there are a number of approaches that are being developed, ranging from trying to prevent bias from happening when an algorithm is trained at the beginning to measuring ways or finding out ways to measure if it does occur and to mitigating the errors when it does happen. So for example, to reduce the likelihood of an algorithm being biased to begin with, it's important to be very careful in one's data collection, not just collect data from convenience samples, but ones that will be representative of the target deployment. It's important to monitor the performance of an algorithm using evaluation measures which are designed to measure fairness, and there are many out there, and they serve different purposes, and it's important to become familiar with how to quantify whether an algorithm is biased or not. And finally, if the algorithm is determined to be biased by some of these measures, often it's possible to mitigate the bias by doing sometimes quite simple techniques. For example, resampling the training data, replacing predictive features where the features themselves are biased with other features that have less bias. And often you can reduce the bias without sacrificing accuracy and other evaluation criteria. The first two areas, privacy and ethics, have a much longer history, and I'd like to conclude by just providing some pointers to various guidelines by both the US federal government and information that's available through many universities regarding both data management and informed consent. And thank you.